My name is Bill Troop. I work for Zipp Speed Weaponry here in Speedway, Indiana, and I'm going to show you how to glue on a tubular tire. First, we'll start with what we need. We've got a tubular wheel, in our cases a Zipp 303 wheel. We've got a tubular tire, in this case a Zipp Tangente 23 tire. For our purpose, our valve stem is already going to be attached, and we've got our Teflon tape underneath as well. Glue, we're going to use Vittoria Mastic glue. A tubing brush that'll allow us to apply the glue. Now the first step that we're going to undertake is to stretch the tubular tire. So we'll begin with everything unglued, and we're going to start by pre-stretching our tire. That way when it's finally time to mount the tire, it's going to be a lot easier. So we'll pop the tire onto the rim bed. It's not important that we actually get the inner layer of the tape on the tire in any certain fashion or shape on the tire bed. We're just going to stretch it. So once we've got it on, we'll inflate to about 150 psi, which is more than you'd ever want to ride with, but will get us a nice even stretch that we can then work with the tire, and we'll leave that overnight. Okay, so we have a pre-stretched tubular, and our next step will now be to apply a thin, consistent layer of tubular glue on the inside of the base tape. We'll start with our Mastic 1 tubular glue. Make sure we get a nice even bead right across the center of the base tape. Again, we don't want to use too much glue, so sparingly is going to be what will do us the most favors here. Once we've got a thin bead of glue on the inside of the base tape right in the middle, we're going to take our paintbrush and apply it very thin and very evenly so that it gets all over all of the base tape. We want to make sure we're especially considerate around the valve stem that we get enough glue to take a good hold once the tire is finally mounted. Very thin layer of glue that will cover all the base tape. And our goal is going to be to change everywhere that the base tape is white into a very light yellow. That'll indicate that we've got glue over the entire thing. We're going to allow this to dry for about 24 hours. The next step in our process is to apply a very thin layer of glue to the tubular wheel itself. This can be done the same day that we apply glue to our tubular tire. It's important when we do this to remember that we keep small, thin layers on the inside of the actual rim bed of the tire itself, or the wheel itself. So with our Mastic 1 glue, and we'll start at where our valve stem meets into our wheel. It's good to remember that this is a good stopping and starting point. As we put more and more layers of glue on, it's going to be hard to decipher where we have and have not applied glue. So it's good to always have a starting and stopping point for yourself. Put a very thin layer of the Vittoria Mastic inside of the tire bed itself. Start with just a few points on the tire. Then we'll take our brush, and we want to be as thin and flat as possible. Try to cover all of the areas of the tire bed itself. Make sure to be mindful of the valve hole and the spoke holes. We don't want to get any errant glue in there. It can create imbalances, and if we get it in the valve hole, it can be very difficult for us to add our valve extender later on. If you do get small amounts of glue into the brake track, they will dissipate after normal riding with the brakes, but it's important to make sure we don't get too much glue in there, as if we do, we can encounter some braking problems and pulsations later on. Our next step is to take our tubular wheel with one layer of glue that's already sat for 24 hours and apply a second thin layer of glue over the entire tire bed of the wheel itself. This is when it becomes most important that we find a starting and stopping point. Since we've already got glue on the inner tire bed, if we're not sure where we stop and where we start, it's impossible to tell if we're going to overlap or not once we get to the end. So we'll begin again at the valve stem like we did before, and we'll apply once again a very, very small, very thin layer of the Vittoria Mastic 1 that will allow us to cover any spots that we might have missed, and also to still dry quickly enough that we don't get any bumps when we mount the tire. Just take a few segments at a time so we ensure that the glue doesn't dry in the middle. So we've got our segments, thin, even layers on the inside. We want to make sure that we're getting any sections that we might have missed with our initial glue job totally covered with our second pass. Again, make sure we don't get any glue inside of the nipple holes, and we want to make sure that we don't get any glue inside of the valve stem hole. When we're gluing around the valve stem, it's important that we get a nice even coat next to the valve stem. Just like with the tubular tire we already glued, we want to make sure we're not sparing with glue there, but we're also not overly anxious with how much glue we put on. So we want to make sure we get a nice, consistent adhesion once the tire mounts. Once you've applied a nice, thin, even layer on the inside of the tire bed and gone all the way back around through to our valve stem once again, we're going to allow this to dry for about 24 hours. This brings us to day number 3 in our tubular gluing process. We have our wheel that now has 2 layers of fully dried Mastic 1 on the outside. Each layer has sat for 24 hours. Our goal now is to put on yet another thin layer around the entire tire bed of the wheel itself. Once we do this, we're going to then just allow it to sit for about 4 to 5 minutes before we physically mount on our tubular tire. So again, a very thin layer on the inside of the tire bed. We'll look once more for any spots that we might have missed during our first 2 gluings, though we probably won't find a lot. We're looking for a thin, even, consistent layer that again doesn't cover any of the nipple holes or the valve hole itself. Once we've done this, we're going to allow this layer only to sit for about 4 to 5 minutes before we take our tubular, which is already dried with glue and is now sat for about 2 days, and apply it to the outside of our very quickly drying layer of Mastic that is now our 3rd layer on this wheel. This is the final step in our tubi gluing process. We now have a tire with a fully dried layer of Mastic 1 from our first day on the inside of it. We have our wheel that now has 2 dried layers of Mastic 1 from 2 days and 1 still fairly tacky layer of Mastic 1 on it so that we can allow the tire to position itself and move around as we mount. It's important when we do this to make sure that we have the badge of the tire itself on the outside, and it's going to sit on the left side of the wheel, or the drive side. We're going to find our valve stem hole, into the valve hole, seat it straight through, and we'll make sure that as we apply this on, we've got a nice evenness to the base tape. It's sometimes best to rest the tire in the wheel down on your knee. This is why it's nice to wear an apron when you're doing it so you don't get your clothes all messy. Tubular glue will not come out of your jeans very easily in one wash. And we're going to roll our tire over and into the middle of the tire bed itself. Before we put any air in, it's best to make sure that we've got a nice even seat on the base tape of the tire itself. Tangents have a nice white center side over here so that you can see the contrast between that and the black, and we get a nice even seat on the rim bed. Then, once we've got it on, and we've got a pretty good even seat with the eye, we're going to add about 20 psi into the system here. So that as we complete the rest of the process, we've got a nice round tire without any flat spots or any hops. We can move this with our still fairly wet tubular glue from side to side, get a good evenness to the base tape. And once we're on, we're going to make sure that the valve section of the tire seats very well into the valve hole section of the rim. And we're going to go ahead and press that in. Make sure that it really seats in there. And once we've got that, we can now give it a spin to make sure everything's even. The nice thing about the Tangente tire is that there's a flat center section with dimples on the outside. So when we look at this against the light, we'll be able to tell very quickly and easily if there's any side-to-side moving where we didn't get an even seat, or if there's any hop up and down where we had maybe just a little bit too much glue one place or another. Take a nice even look and make sure that our flat section of the tire is centered right on the wheel and that there's no hop whatsoever. Go back to our pump and put about 150 psi into the wheel. This is why it's important that we leave that final layer of glue a little bit wet on the outside of the rim bed. What that's going to do is as our tire fully inflates, it's going to finally take its final shape, and that little bit of wet glue will allow the tire to conform to the rim surface. Take one more good look. Make sure that everything's fully centered. There's no hop, no lateral play, and everything's ready to go. I like to allow my tires to sit for about 2 days so that they can fully dry before I ride them. It's important during this entire process that if at any time you feel you're in over your head or that you can't complete any of the steps with full confidence, take your tire to a professional, bring it into a shop, and ask them to install them for you.